Good afternoon and welcome. I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is the 125th meeting of the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, pursuant to Standing Order 1082. We are continuing our study of migration challenges and opportunities for Canada in the 21st century. And I notice a number of substituting members today. Great, and welcome. I thought Bill Casey was here, but he's gone. You're now. You're a double substitute.
Oh, okay.
All right, very good. So just to bring the substituting members on board so you know what is going on, this is a longer study than normally we've done on this committee, and it's looking at migration in the 21st century. It's looking at the challenges, the reasons why people are on the move, where they're on the move from and to, both forced migration in terms of refugees and planned or voluntary migration in terms of economic migrants and those related to that in terms of students, temporary, etc. So it's a big picture study to try to look at what Canada's response should be to a world that is on the move more than it's ever been in the history of humanity. So we're doing that. We've had a number of meetings, and today we're going to welcome His Excellency Peeters Oosthuizen. Did I say that correctly? Oosthuizen, who is representative of the European Union here in Ottawa, and with him is Bryce de Schieter. Schieter. And they very graciously accepted our invitation to come and give us a European perspective. In the second hour of the meeting, we'll be following up on some of this in an in-camera meeting. So just to give you a little heads up that what we ask about in this first hour could inform our discussion in the in-camera meeting as well. So just to be aware of that. Over to you, Your Excellency, and again, thank you for accepting our request to come to us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the possibility to come and be a witness. So, thinking about what I'm going to say about the migration and your ongoing preparation of the reports, I can definitely assure you that there is quite a lot what European Union and Europe can say about the current developments and current undertakings related to migration. So I hope that today's conversations will help you in drafting the report in different ways and from different perspectives. So migration is not a local phenomenon, nor it can be reduced to the national or even regional challenge. Wars, violence, persecution drove worldwide forced displacements to the new high in 2017 for the 5th year in a row. So therefore we are talking about something which becomes somehow permanent. 68.5 million people are displaced as of the end of 2017. Among them were 16.2 million people who became displaced just during 2017 itself, indicating a huge number of people on the move, and if we deduct it more precisely, it is equivalent to 44,500 people displaced each day, and approximately one person displaced every 2 seconds. So those numbers are speaking for themselves. It is truly a global phenomenon which continues and is likely to continue to, in the foreseeable future, to have a major impact on our societies, on our economies, and on our political debates. The European Union is, due to its geographical location, intrinsic openness, and its interconnections to trade, travel routes, and its open frontiers in the midst of this challenge. The EU is located in close proximity to several crisis zones. Our situation is different from other countries that have secure and physical borders. We are also close to some of the countries with the highest population growth. To give but one example, Nigeria has less than 200 million inhabitants today, and it is estimated to have 1 billion at the end of this century. This is an enormous challenge, but let me add, also enormous opportunity. Being a global phenomenon, migration requires global attention, political will, and global shared vision. In this respect, we are grateful that Canada remains our strong partner in international fora, at the UN as well as the G7, calling for solidarity and global migration management. We also acknowledge the contribution of Canada in resettling 40,000 Syrian refugees since 2015. After this brief yet necessary introduction, let me address the first point raised by this honorable committee, and that is, what is the state of play in the European Union or its neighborhood? It is fair to say that a combination of the factors in 2015 and 2016 led to unprecedented influx of irregular migrants to the EU. It is also fair to say that the EU was less than optimally prepared for an event of such proportions. I will not delve in detail. Suffice to say that between 2015 and 2017, the EU received over 3.4 million asylum seekers. To compound the problem, the vast majority of these applicants arrived in very limited number of the countries who could not have sufficient structures and capacity to handle such an inflow. That said, the EU is today far better prepared to handle the migration phenomena and to face the challenge. We have made significant important strides during the last 18 months. We have stemmed irregular migration. Arrivals has been dramatically reduced down to 97% in the Eastern Mediterranean route and 80% in the Central Mediterranean route. Numbers are now back, if I may say so, to pre-crisis years. Meanwhile, we have saved over 690,000, and I repeat, 690,000 lives at sea in the past 3 years, thanks to combined efforts of the EU and its member states. This impressive progress has been made possible by improved management of our external borders. As Canada knows very well, the effective management of external border is a precondition to any successful migration policy. I should also underline that the EU has reinforced its external borders, not closed them. It put in place structures to speed processing of claims at the border, register and process arrivals. Furthermore, given the geographical situation of the European Union, a robust migration policy should not be limited only to effectively managing the borders. It is illusionary to imagine stemming flows of the people by erecting walls or building fences. For that matter, it is difficult to imagine where any such wall could actually be built around Europe, given our interconnections with Asia and Africa. A successful integration policy and immigration policy has to encompass an external dimension aimed at tackling the root causes that force people to move. We have stepped up our cooperation with countries of origin and transit on return and readmission. Despite some success in concluding new non-legally binding arrangements, and I would like to mention a few countries here: Bangladesh, Guinea, Ethiopia, the Gambia, and soon, hopefully, Ivory Coast, securing third countries' cooperation on readmission of their own nationals remains a challenge. Lack of cooperation from certain origin countries is not helping, and it represents perhaps the major challenge at this stage. In the longer term, the situation can only improve by addressing the roots of the phenomena like we see in Syria, tackle the issues of good governance in Africa. Given the projections of demographic trend, people will only be willing to stay in their countries if they have good economic perspectives, but also freedom and protection of fundamental rights. Assisting African countries in creating better economic opportunities, in improving their governance, in fighting corruption and mismanagement is not an expense, it is investment in our future. The EU is Africa's closest neighbor and biggest investor, the main trading and development partner, and the key security provider. I would like to mention just a few figures for the reference. The EU is providing 31 billion euros in official development assistance to Africa between 2014 to 2020 to boost Africa's economy, to give young people in the continent a chance to build a future, to ensure good food security and access to energy, and to anchor good governance and respect of human rights. The EU member states held an investment stock of 291 billion euros in 2016 in Africa, making the EU the biggest investor in that continent. The EU also offers free access to the EU market via economic partnership agreements with the countries of North Africa and everything but arms schemes with the rest of the continent. Let me provide you an overview of other developments in migration, what we are doing right now. First of all, I would like to state the obvious that migration is something which features very strongly on the political agenda of the European Union. Just 3 examples. Ministers of Interior of the European Union, 28 member states, discussed migration on the 12th of October, Ministers of Foreign Affairs yesterday, and heads of state and government will discuss migration later this week when they will have a meeting on the 17th and 18th of October. So just to demonstrate that migration is definitely close and high on the agenda of political leadership. In State of the Union speech last month, President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, announced a number of new important proposals that will strengthen our work on migration and asylum, and allow me to mention some of them. EU leaders agreed to strengthen the role of European Border and Coast Guard. 10,000 permanent staff with own equipment and tools will be provided from national border agencies. A 2.2 billion euros budget between 2021 and 2027 to finance its operations, and a strong mandate to launch joint operations not only with its own staff within the EU, but also outside the European Union. As I said, this is crucial to effectively manage European external borders and provide a high level of security within the European Union. But at the same time, Europe will not close its borders and will continue to offer safety to those in need of the protection. In addition to strong external borders, we are proposing to reinforce the European Union Agency for Asylum. This agency will become a major tool in strengthening European solidarity in increasing readiness to manage future migration challenges. To assist member states in better handling migration, this agency will be able to provide the operational technical assistance in the timely manner. While granting protection to the most vulnerable remains a priority, returning migrants who are ineligible according to international legislation is equally important for the well-functioning asylum and migration system. Despite increased efforts, the rate of effective returns throughout the EU decreased from 46% in 2016 to 37% in 2017. We will work to expedite return procedures and increase the overall return rate in full respect of fundamental rights. Legal migration is an integral part of EU's comprehensive approach to migration and goes hand in hand with firm policy and tackling irregular flows and ensuring stronger border protection, streamlining asylum procedures, and more effective returns. We have a legal path of legal migration for skilled workers, a EU Blue Card scheme. We have adopted new rules to make it easier for the foreign students, researchers, trainees, and volunteers to get a permit to come to the EU and facilitate their access to the labor market. For example, we double scholarships and placements for students with African countries. We launched an initiative to coordinate pilot projects with selected third countries on legal migration to fill shortages in the labor markets, help countries of origin to build the capacity through circular and labor migration projects. The EU internal resettlement initiatives have demonstrated that unsafe and irregular migration can be replaced with legal and safe channels for persons in need of international protection. We need to make full use of other legal avenues for persons in need of protection. Since 2015, 2 successful EU internal resettlement programs have been helped for over 38,000 people of the most vulnerable find shelter within the EU between different EU member states. To coordinate European efforts in the long term, the European Commission has proposed to set up a permanent Union resettlement framework as part of the overall asylum framework. Integration of third country migrants into the labour market is key to ensure a positive impact of migration. We are interested in how Canada's immigration policy addresses the admission of immigrants with skills that match their economic needs and facilitate the long-term integration in the labour market, including recognition of foreign credentials and the mentoring programs. In conclusion, much has changed since 2015, but we do have a lot of work ahead of us to manage migration in the safe and orderly manner, pursuing a comprehensive migration approach, including on legal migration. We have shared our experience with and learned from our Canadian counterparts at various levels in numerous occasions. Despite geographical differences, we know that the challenges we face are increasingly similar. We are grateful for Canada's continued cooperation, and we look forward to further exchanges where beneficial for both sides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'd like to have given you an hour. That's very helpful. Ms. Zahid for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming today and sharing the information and about the programs you are doing in European community. We have seen that as of 2015, Europe faced the biggest wave of mass immigration since the Second World War, and the peak in migrant number was over 1 million back in 2015 and 16. Do you have any recent numbers?
Yes, I can go back to my presentation. I will not read it again, don't worry. But I will come back to you and I will tell you exactly what is the figures if we split it between the years. And that will come here. So if we had a 1.3 million in 2015, then the same figure was more or less the same in 2016. Then in 2017, it dropped to 800,000 people. So overall tendency is going down.
What do you see? Have you done any study on what is motivating the crossers? Is it the economic background, or is it because of some other reasons? What are the factors which are driving more migration?
It is very complex question, and I will try to be, let's say, as concise as I can be. I think we need to split arrival of the migrants to European Union via different kind of routes. And I think the main reasons for people traveling or migrating to Europe would have different backgrounds. First of all, if we look at Eastern Mediterranean route, which is link between Turkey and Greece, either land border or sea border, then most probably the highest numbers of the people would be coming from Syria. That was the case in 2015, and that was the case still in 2016. Nowadays, there is a certain shift in nationalities who are actually coming to Europe via that route. But basically, the main reason was ongoing war in Syria, which sparked a high increase of the numbers of the people. If you move to the central Mediterranean route, then actually the story is slightly different, because the nationalities you would see on those boats would come from Bangladesh. You would see Eritreans, and you would see Libyans. Most recently, increasing number of Tunisians, and quite many from Western Africa. So basically, it would be Nigeria as dominant. For those, the main reason would be economical one, trying to reach Europe for economical benefit. I'm not playing down their conditions in some of those countries for those people, but it is not war related. It is not migration because of war or other let's say, disasters. It is more economical and economical related migration. And the most recent phenomena is migration in the Western Mediterranean, linking Morocco and Spain. The composition of migrants you would see on those ships mostly would come from West Africa again. Those are slightly different composition as in the Mediterranean, or in the central Mediterranean. Basically, they would come from Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Nigeria. And there again, it would be mainly economical migration.
In our few last meetings, we have heard from some witnesses about the relationship between the legal and the illegal immigration channels, and how eliminating legal channels can drive migrants to use the illegal routes. For example, in Spain, when they eliminated the seasonal work visa for Africans, led to a migrant surge, and bringing back a visa program saw illegals number drop. So you have mentioned about some programs which you have brought in Europe. Have you seen that bringing some more legal programs decreases the number of illegal immigrants? What relationship do you find between them?
I would like to mention specifically here several things linked with our Operation Sophia in the Mediterranean. The mandate of that operation, which is EU's operation together with the member states, gave in 2016 the possibility of arresting smugglers and taking away the means of migration, meaning the ships. And third element for that operation was to increase the capacity of Libyan coast guards. And few examples just to mention. Because of that operation, we managed to arrest around 200 individuals who were directly involved in smuggling operations. Secondly, because of the operation, we managed to dismantle or take away approximately 500 ships which were involved in illegal migration activities. And last but not least, if you look at the events taking place outside Libyan coast, due to increase of the capacity of Libyan coast guards, basically during the last couple of months, the numbers were significantly decreasing because all the operation was contained and managed by Libyan coast guards, which did not exist before. So the short answer to your question is there is a lot of illegal activity ongoing, and there is a lot of need to be active in attacking or tackling it. And if you know where to address it, then smuggling activities might go down.
Sometimes it's...
I think I need to end there. Mr. Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Ambassador for being here today, and Mr. Shatari as well. This is that's a great deal of information that you've provided, and I know you just mentioned the Operation Sophia as one of the items and one of the areas that you've been dealing with. But I'm wondering if you can update me on another progress. I've been reading a little bit about the Dublin Agreement and the renegotiation in that area. And I wonder if you could update us on that Dublin Agreement in regards to the settlement of refugees.
Dublin Agreement is under revision at the moment. and the European Commission presented its proposals to European Council, and at the moment it is for the member states to discuss and come up with a final decision. It is evident that Dublin arrangements should be revisited, and we need to make sure that actually member states find the relevant compromises between themselves, specifically related to the fact where the migrant is registered, either it is the first entry or not, and how that information is then circulated between the EU member states. And of course, additionally to that comes another element I mentioned, and that is internal resettlement of the migrants and refugees who reach the EU. Discussions between member states are ongoing, and not always discussions are easy between member states. And I don't want to predict any kind of calendar when that discussion will be finalized. But the mere fact that heads of state and government are going to discuss migration again at the summit later this week demonstrates that it is not only for ministers of interior to find a compromise, but it is also at the highest level of heads of state and government. So this is one of the key priorities to get the legal framework and cooperation framework between member states to be done.
Excuse me. Yes, and I mean, when you look at it, I understand that people or immigrants, asylum seekers arriving in Europe today still aren't allowed to choose the country or the state that they might want to be present in as far as an asylum request goes. So do you think that there's anything we could do in Canada in regards to make any sense for Canada to enter similar agreements, entertaining claiming asylum persons with European countries, such as some of the European countries are doing right now?
That definitely would be.
Pardon me, with the goal to kind of prevent this idea of shopping around to find the country you want to be in.
One of the things which played an important role for addressing the Dublin arrangements was that in order to avoid shopping possibilities of migrants arriving in Europe, that actually we have all the database, fingerprinting and applications done in one first stop, one first place. Otherwise, if those fingerprints would not be taken and they would not be stored, then in fact the asylum shopping might start. Now it is addressed by far in comprehensive way. It is done in Greece, it is done in Italy, in for all who arrive. Then it is just for agreements between EU member states to make sure that actually the migrants move around, internal resettlement. Concerning interest of Canada to participate, that definitely would be a sovereign decision of Canada. There might be different kind of approaches because within the groups arriving in Europe, we see people who are definitely coming from war zones, and we need to find the protection for them for humanitarian grounds or other reasons. But then there is a third category which would be more linked with economical migration. So it would require certain definition potentially from Canada what kind of specific migration you would like to, you would be interested. Either this is the one of people coming from the war-thrown countries like Syria or elsewhere, or you would be interested to have more of the economical migrants who might be with the skills and would be interested in finding the way.
Thank you. Thank you. Just in relation to time, do you know of any, do any of the EU countries issue work permits to those currently waiting for an asylum hearing?
Sorry?
Are there any EU countries that issue work permits, like
yes,
job opportunities for the asylum seekers that are there?
We have let's say, several approaches. One approach is those who have skills. We are facilitating their integration into the labor market, and some of the EU member states are very keen to make sure that integration is happening fast, and they facilitate, let's say, openness of the businesses in the EU, different EU member states, to find a job for them, because basically economical integration is the most easiest way of addressing it. Having said that, there is another scheme I alluded in my introductory remarks, and that is the EU Blue Card, which is not for those who arrived as asylum seekers or migrants into the territory of the EU, but who are in third countries and who has a set of knowledge and credentials for all kind of work that they can apply for the EU Blue Card, which would be working permit. So that is ongoing activity.
And are there areas that, are there countries that you know of, specific countries in the EU today that that are working on encouraging private sponsorship of refugees, such as private organizations, groups of five, nonprofits, church groups, that sort of thing?
Very briefly.
Yes, very briefly. We have several private endeavors who helped to save the lives on the sea. That activity has been provided by private sponsors, Médecins Sans Frontières and others, who actually chartered the ships, and large part of their financing came from let's say, private groups. As concerns the movement of the migrants under the private scheme, it's not so often visible at the moment in the European Union. Canada is definitely having a different kind of approach to this.
Thank you very much. Ms. Malcolmson, and welcome to congratulations on your upgrade.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to start by recognizing the University of Toronto Women in the House program is on the Hill today, and I'm very glad to have Gabrielle da Silva with me, who is training in human rights, among other things, so this is a especially good day for her to be shadowing us on the Hill.
We may have some others out there, do we? Yeah. Welcome, and this won't come out of your time, Sheila.
You're a great chair. So my first question, I'm going to speak from my own experience in Canada and the riding Nanaimo Ladysmith that I represent. We're hearing a lot from people on the ground this is in British Columbia, about the lack of capacity within Canada's immigration system to handle the massive influx of applications that are coming. And a particularly painful one for families is when they apply to sponsor a family member or hope that their study permit will be extended. They wait and wait and wait. There's stress on the family. They're unsure of their status. They're separated. And they're unable to make long-term plans because of really feeling in limbo and in a constant state of uncertainty. Last year, this committee recommended that Canada provide more information to applicants to explain its visa denials, so that for right now what we get is just a kind of a terse and generic letter that doesn't provide any detail of the specific reasons for the denials, so people don't know if they want to reapply, how they might be able to correct that. So I'm curious, given the volume of migrants that the EU has experienced, do you have programs in place so that visa applicants have a clear idea of what the roadmap is ahead of them, but especially explaining their visa denials so that they can be properly amended and have some assistance in navigating the bureaucracy?
There are two parts and two answers to your question. First of all, I can't speak on behalf of EU member states, because visa applications and visas, and that would be for any kind of third country person outside the EU who applied for visa and traveling to the EU, it is prerogative of the EU member state individually. Although we have the Schengen system, therefore the traveling between EU member states is easy, but the person decided to apply for one specific country to travel and that country's embassy, wherever it would be, would take that forward. What kind of answer that member state will give when the application process is over is still responsibility of that country. So I don't have a good answer to that. As concerns the migrants of all kinds arriving and already being in the territory of the EU, we are doing our best to make sure that actually the speed of processing of their demands is done in the shortest possible time. And one example of that is the number I mentioned of EU staff, European Border Security Agency, which will have 10,000 people. And that is 10,000 people additionally to be sent as a help if required by any EU member state who might face a very challenging environment. So it is basically mobilization of border guards capacity all over the EU. If in any of the country there is a spare capacity, it might be sent to that country to help to tackle the problems as they arise. And that would help registration and processing.
Excellent.
So therefore, for us, the key point is the personnel and availability of the numbers of the people who would tackle the given numbers.
Excellent, thank you. Another difficulty that I've heard, in particular from the Central Vancouver Island Multicultural Society, is the lack of available childcare. The pattern that they've observed for refugee families and immigrant families that have come to Nanaimo, that they often stay at home to take care of their young children if they can't find affordable childcare, and that then limits their abilities to take language lessons and therefore leaves them more isolated and out of the workforce. Do you have examples that you've seen within the EU programs that are made available to such families, childcare or otherwise, that ensure that they can get access to language training, get the support at home they need in order to be able to leave for job training and language training so that they have economic and integration possibilities?
Language training definitely is one of the key issues for any migrant arriving in the territory of the European Union. And again, it will depend from country to country where actually the migrant would arrive and would be resettled and would stay. But to my knowledge, social systems of individual countries would make sure that language training is the priority, and trying to accommodate and give the possibilities for those who won't have the capacity of addressing and going and participating in language training. And that might encompass also element of childcare, to making sure that actually childcare is probably next room for linked with the language training. That would help the integration process.
That's good confirmation, thank you. A third area that we've had difficulty with in Canada in my own riding is on the topic of family reunification. And we hear very plaintively from refugees who've come to Canada, they cannot relax into this country while they know that their family is still in danger. They can't completely settle. I have a constituent, Fatima, who she and her two daughters were refugees from Eritrea. Once they had come to Canada as refugees, sponsored by the neighborhood church in Nanaimo, who's just been terrific at supporting them, they found that the father of the family, who they thought had been killed in the Civil War, in fact was alive. So they've now been waiting years since then. They can't get a timeline within our system about when his processing will be complete. And at this point, her daughters are starting to say to her, we don't even believe that our father is still alive. There's no evidence of him. This is one example in a big heartache in the community. So do you have examples that you've seen around programs that can shorten and facilitate the family reunification process to avoid that
Very briefly.
dislocation?
Yeah, very briefly answering to this question. We see that one of the priorities when the registration of the migrants arriving in Europe are registered, that we try to address either they have already some relatives in the EU. They might travel to the EU or undertake very dangerous trips across the sea, basically for reuniting with the family. So if that is the element, then actually that facilitates, let's say, the process. If there is no link with any family registered, then of course it's slightly different case. But I think the reunification element is always kept in mind specifically because of the humanitarian aspect of it. And when each and individual country decides on the application, that is high as the priority. I can't give you any kind of specific figures, how often and how frequently it is used, and either it is positive balance or not. But I know definitely that it is used very often as one of the reasons for proceeding and stepping up the process if it is linked with the family unification.
Thank you. Mr. Tabera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. And I too also have two University of Toronto students in the back there that are observing today. So thank you for your presentation, your initial speech. It was excellent and very well articulated. And you mentioned that the EU received 3.4 million asylum seekers, and that is the largest migration since the Second World War. The International Migration Report in 2017 from the UN concentrated mostly on economic migrants. I'm just going to show to you some of the numbers, just because we're discussing migration trends around the world and just understanding what Canada is facing in the future. So we had in 2000 we had 173 million worldwide economic migrants, and in 2010 we had 220 million, and in 2017 we had 258 million. So we're seeing, because at the beginning of your in your testimony you mentioned about in Africa and the reasons why a lot of these migrants are leaving is because there's not stable economic conditions for them to prosper and flourish. So we're not just seeing that in Africa, but we're seeing that in various places, and the numbers indicate that there's many migrants traveling all over. So my question, I wanted to kind of get to a specific country and understand a little bit in an EU state what these conditions, these global conditions are meaning. So how many migrants have been accepted in the EU last year? And what are those numbers in Germany, and how do you compare? How do they compare to other EU countries? So we want to just have a comparison to see what Germany has done and some of the examples that we can learn from them.
So in terms of the numbers, asylum application and citizenship for main groups for the Germany number last year, 2017, was 222,562. So 222,000. Yes.
Okay.
Germany.
And were they? And I remember you mentioned in 2015 and 2016 you had relatively the same numbers of asylum seekers at 1.3 million, roughly. Mm-hmm. And then in 2017 that has went down to 800,000.
Yeah.
So in terms of asylum seekers going to Germany, is that number lower than 220,000, or are higher, I mean, in other years?
That number also for Germany went down.
Okay.
So as overall numbers declined, also the applications for Germany went down.
Okay.
And mentioning probably a little bit more of the origins, specifically for Germany, 50,000 were coming from Syria alone, of that figure, and approximately 23,000 from Iraq, and approximately 18,000 from Afghanistan. So those were the three major, let's say, countries from where the applicants for Germany were generated.
And my next question would be, we're seeing even within Canada, we're seeing a larger scale of asylum seekers coming to Canada. Last year in the summer, we had a significant number of Haitian migrants, and this year we're having more of Nigerian migrants. And now that matters because depending on what's happening in certain regions of the world, population growth, economic opportunities, there's more asylum seekers looking to have better prospects. Those numbers have been increased. Previously, in 2008, we've had a spike in those numbers as well, and we did face these numbers in the summertime as well. What are the main issues that the EU faces in terms of migration? And again, I'm going to get to Germany again. And how is Germany addressing the issues of migration?
I think the specific answer what Germany is doing would be the best for the Germans to answer, because that's very national activity, if I may say so, because that's not from the EU perspective. Individual countries are tackling each and specific case, and that's the responsibility of the individual EU member states. There is not so much what we can say from the EU's perspective, but knowing the internal debates, political debates, as well as the activities undertaken by the German ministries and involved services, I can say that they do enormous, first of all, allocations for the people to make sure that the number of people involved in addressing the applications and processing them are drastically increased over the last couple of years. That was exactly the first or number one issue for the German system to tackle with that particular problem.
So I just wanted to mention in your opening remarks, you mentioned about fast integration and skills and matching those asylum seekers or those immigrants coming there. So is there a process that the EU does to speed up migration process while maintaining the security?
In fact, economical opportunities and openness of the European businesses has been high on the agenda for many EU member states to make sure that the opportunities in economical sectors and economical activities are open for the migrants. The track record between different EU member states would differ. In some member states, not naming them, this activity undertook very good results, and the migrants relatively easily found the jobs. In some other places, that took by far more longer time, and not so active participation of the businesses themselves. And I think that is a little bit of previous culture of different countries, how they approach the migration issues in general. And that might, let's say, held back some businesses of being active in that activity.
We need to end there. Thank you. I'm just going to slip in one little question. We had a little overage on the other side. I want to ask you about Venezuela. And when I looked at the migration patterns coming out of Venezuela, largely going to other South American countries and into Central America. But the missing factor of about 500,000, I've been told there are a number of people going into Europe from Venezuela, and whether or not you have any information on that, particularly Scotland, I heard, which is still part of the EU this week.
You are very pessimistic somehow. I don't have the deadline of this week. I think this might still last for 2019, but that's a different hearing.
I have Scottish background. I would support that.
Yeah, I know. But concerning Venezuela, two things there. I know that Mr. Grande, who is the UN High Commissioner for Migration, visited the region earlier or last week, And he actually participated in debate yesterday in Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels, as he comes from region around Venezuela, in order to make sure that actually EU member states, ministers of foreign affairs, are well informed on increasing migration, let's say, problem in the region. And you asked about the EU then, and that is pre-crisis, I would say. In 2017, the highest number of Venezuelans was in Spain. Spain. And that was approximately 12,000 people. But having said that, you need to know also that many Venezuelans would have a double citizenship, and that would be Portuguese and Spanish citizenships. And I would say if Venezuela would enter even in more volatile situation, that would be a significant problem also for the EU, because we would need to take care of the EU citizens.
Thank you. Mr. Tilson for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. You know, we've listened to the Bulgarians who wanted to put up a wall, although the Bulgarian ambassador assured me it was a fence. And we have, Denmark had talked about reinstituting border security, returning to the border security. I've talked to British members of Parliament, and they've said that this migration problem is one of the many reasons for Brexit. The Germans, of course, Dr. Merkel said, well, you know, she welcomed all kinds of people, and then, of course, there's stories in the media today that one of her partners in the coalition went too far to the right and was just saying, no, we don't want anybody. And, of course, that had an effect on the Bavarian elections. So there's obviously a dispute in many ways, many different ways among the member states. So my question is, to create European policy, how is the EU dealing with these different differences, most of which are negative?
I should say that the debates in the European Union, imagining the 28 EU member states around the table, are not always easy ones, as there are different players and different voices around the table. But having said that, I should say that in 2015 and 2016, when the crisis hits the door of the EU, I was positively surprised by the speed in those circumstances, how quickly EU reacted and how quickly EU took decisions. Having said that, of course, the political impact might take a certain time to reach the level of political reality. And probably now we see it in different kind of elections. Either it is in Sweden, either it is in Germany, either this is in Denmark or Bulgaria. So I would assume that probably politicians in some of the EU member states will become more prudent regarding the migration issues. But at the same time, the general trust in the room is that we need to improve our system and management, but this is not about the closing the borders. So there might be different kind of voices around, and of course different political players will use their voices, but it is more about the capacity of handling it and return policies, because not everyone who arrives in the EU is eligible for staying in the EU, and making sure that actually those who need gets the protection and not everyone who arrives gets the jobs. That type of debate will continue, but it will become more difficult in terms of political landscape in the EU. But until now, I see that actually the EU was not paralyzed in taking decisions when it comes to the asylum and migration.
I have one more question, Mr. Chairman, and that is, in Canada, as you probably know, we have these illegal asylum seekers from the United States, well, the government will call them irregular asylum seekers. But the issue comes, particularly in the cities of Toronto and Montreal, is who pays. You know, in the province of Ontario and the province of Quebec, the city of Toronto, the city of Montreal say, well, you caused all this, Mr. Prime Minister, you pay. And they have paid some, but not enough. So it reminds me of the migrants that come across the Mediterranean to particularly Italy and Greece, where the issue was the Italians and the Greeks would say, you know, we're dealing with all these, the cost to us is awful compared to what it is in Sweden or other countries. That issue was raised a number of years ago, and the southern states said, you aren't sharing in the cost. Can you brief us on whether that issue has been resolved, and if so, how did it get resolved?
One of the replies from the EU side, and I'm not saying it is perfect, and I'm not saying that it is the most successful one, but it is the internal resettlement. That it is agreement between EU member states proportionally how many migrants they would take from those countries who are the most exposed, namely Italy and Greece. And of course, there are number of member states who successfully implemented what they promised. There are others who unsuccessfully performed, and there are others who actually brought the European Union as institutions to the European Court of Justice, saying it was illegal. So, from one side, there was a decision taken by the EU, we will do it, and we will have the resettlement, and they agreed on the numbers everyone will accept. At the same time, implementation side was slightly lacking behind. So there is something we can continue to improve in order to make sure that the resettlement actually functions. And resettlement within the EU between member states is somehow the reply of solidarity between EU member states.
You give an excellent summary of what's going on in Europe, Mr. Ambassador, and we thank you very much.
Thank you. We started a little bit late because of the vote, but I'll give you 2 minutes, Mr. Ayoub.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to use my time as well as possible. Thank you for coming here today. Your opinion is of interest to me, but for Canada, in your opinion, based on your experience in the European Union, is Canada going through a migration crisis according to you? Thank you for your question. There are different sizes of magnitude when it comes to what a crisis is. We might have a different assessment of what a crisis is. It depends on the experience. It depends on the arrival of migrants.
And Canada, what EU experienced in 2015 and 16, of course, those are by far bigger numbers. And if from that pure perspective, I would say that was a crisis, and probably the current numbers are Canada receives irregular migrants might be low. Having said that, each individual cases are completely different, and we can't make
Merci.
the comparison.
Merci, comme j'ai très peu de temps.
Thank you. I have very little time. You're aware of the agreement, the third-party safe agreement. What's your opinion about this agreement when it comes to immigration?
I would say internal politics between the two countries to make sure what kind of definitions are used, safe countries and safe returns. We have exactly the same kind of conversations in Europe, specifically concerning the third countries, and I know how complex those conversations are. So I don't have a good answer to give to the discussions you have between US and Canada.
Peut-être me donner votre opinion sur ce qui se passe.
But could you give me your opinion of what's happening in Europe?
We have a lot of discussions, but if I may say, with a different type of countries. And probably one example I would like to mention is Turkey, because safe returns and agreements with Turkey is something what we discussed specifically after the events in 2016 and 2017 in the country. What kind of definition we should have for that particular country. So there is always a debate on safe returns, and it's no, when we discuss readmission agreements, that always comes as on the front line. And we are trying to make sure that the definition is well interpreted and well implemented when it comes to the safe returns.
Thank you. You got 3. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your generosity and your time. I suspect as we do this study, we may come back to your office to see if you have other information we may find helpful. So we're going to suspend for a few minutes, and we move into an in-camera meeting, and you'll know whether or not you're supposed to be here.
Thank you.